Newzroom Africa's United States correspondent Simon Marks joins me now from Washington, D.C. Simon, a very good afternoon to you, well, South African time. What has been the response or the reaction in the United States to the President Donald Trump's announcements last night? All major trading partners of course, we're at the receiving end of what he announced. It should be noted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, every single country virtually was at the receiving end of what he announced. And Donald Trump made it clear in that speech yesterday that he views friends of the United States as almost worse trading partners than foes of the United States. So friends, allies and partners were in no way spared from the actions that he took. In terms of the reaction, it's coming in thick and fast because the trading day is now, of course, underway on Wall Street. We're into the first hour of trading there. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down more than 3.5 percentage points in value at the moment. The S&P 500 down 4 percentage points in value, and the Nasdaq down nearly 5 percentage points in value. That, of course, the tech-heavy index. So market traders on Wall Street and investors all over the United States are voting with their feet. They are giving this move by President Trump the thumbs down. And we're in a situation here where President Trump, his Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, the loyalists within his administration who sat in the White House Rose Garden applauding his every syllable as he made this announcement, are the only people really here who argue that this is genuinely going to lead to what President Trump calls Boomtown USA. There are no serious-minded economists, certainly not a single Nobel Prize-winning economist, arguing that this is going to do anything other than create inflation, possibly stagflation in the United States, and prod the country down the road towards a recession. The prospect of an American recession now becomes increasingly proximate. But the administration insists that that's the wrong narrative, that actually what's going to happen is that foreign producers who have been shipping goods to the United States are going to realize that if they would only come to the United States and make their products in the United States, then they could avoid all US sanctions. Even if there were sufficient numbers of producers out there willing to do that, it is going to take so long for all of them to come here, invest their money, build manufacturing plants, that by the time manufacturing is actually happening here, the American economy will be beset by recession, by inflation, and by public uproar over what the president is doing. That's what the economists say. President Trump argues that he can still thread the needle and make it work.
Do those economists believe so, even when everyone knows that the U.S. has a huge market and everyone wants to trade with the United States of America?
Yeah, and of course that is why around the world there has been such shock that the United States is now being presided over by the most protectionist government that this country has seen since the 1930s. I think it is worth making the point that Joe Biden's administration was pretty protectionist, but what Donald Trump has done is inherited those tariffs that President Biden put in place and really now is pushing them to the max and declaring essentially a trade war on every single country around the world. And what the president appears to be trying to do is to eradicate any trade deficit that the United States faces with any one of its trading partners. For Donald Trump, the concept of individual bilateral trade deficits is simply unconscionable. So he's trying to erase them. And as he made clear in that speech yesterday, he has even greater ideals in mind. What he hopes to achieve ultimately, and he talks about this fairly regularly, is to, as he puts it, accrue so much money from tariffs that the United States will eventually be able to scrap income tax, that the government will run based off the tariff revenues that customs here collects. And he looks back at 1880, 1890, when he says that was the way that the country was running. But of course, in the 1880s, it was a much smaller country. The economy was created only to serve a small percentage of the population. It certainly wasn't an economic program that was designed to appeal to minorities in the United States, to black Americans who were still struggling to achieve any measure of civil rights. So he has this sort of rose-tinted spectacles about the economy of the 1880s and thinks that you can somehow resurrect that in 2025.
But how much of an issue were his guesstimates there, as some people have called them, that the numbers he bandied about were simply untrue as far as some people were concerned? How much of that was an issue in the United States?
Well, the numbers were complete fiction in the sense that Donald Trump was saying that they were one thing and they weren't. I mean, President Trump, for example, was arguing that South Korea, which has a free trade agreement with the United States, is tariffing American products to the tune of 50%. That's not what South Korea is doing. If the way they've done this calculation is to look at the number of imports that they get from South Korea or from South Africa versus the number of exports. And that number was derived by working out the deficit and multiplying it by 0.5, because the president thought that a penalty of 0.5 would be adequate and feel pretty lenient, and it wouldn't be a dollar for dollar tariff or tax on products coming in from those countries. So all of these numbers, the numbers for South Africa, the numbers for the European Union, the numbers for South Korea, for Japan, for India, all of them were based essentially on a determination to eradicate all trade deficits. They were not a reflection of tariffs that the United States is paying when it sends products to those countries, which is how President Trump presented them.
When he, of course, announced the South African tariffs, he made what some people consider to have been snide remarks about bad things happening in South Africa, and the fact that, and he disclosed as well, that the United States, his administration was keeping a beady eye on the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, two things about that. First of all, Vuyo, I think in general terms, it is pretty clear that as far as this American government is concerned, AGOA and the preferential trade status that signatories to it have enjoyed with the United States, that's completely out of the water. No one here now imagines that AGOA is going to be extended, reinvigorated in any way. These tariffs clearly override AGOA, and in the minds of the Trump administration, it seems all but certain that AGOA is dead and buried. But the second issue, that issue pertaining to the language that Donald Trump used yesterday, the commentary that he offered on South Africa, that's going to be a massive problem for the South African government, because we're now in a situation where whenever Donald Trump finds himself talking about South Africa, yesterday as he was rattling through all of these different countries and the tariffs they were going to pay, previously when questions have been asked at the White House and South Africa has been mentioned, he always now starts talking about the big human rights problems. It's a big mess in South Africa. The United States has been giving the country billions of dollars. The mainstream media here needs to go and take a look at what's happening. And remember that those comments yesterday were the first since a government delegation visited Washington last weekend, part of a visit to New York that they were making to talk about the upcoming G20. And that delegation came to Washington, D.C. to meet Trump administration figures, specifically to try and push back against some of the assertions that President Trump keeps voicing. It clearly has not had an impact on the president. And for Pretoria, for President Ramaphosa, trying to figure out how you restore the bilateral relationship, that's going to be hard enough. but trying to work out how you get into the president's mind to stop him from reflexively going on the verbal assault against South Africa any time the country gets mentioned in his presence. That's going to be an even tougher nut to crack.
Simon Marks, that's where we're going to leave it for now. Thank you very much for your time, our Washington correspondent there, reflecting on the back, of course, of the announcements by U.S. President Donald Trump, the tariffs he has imposed. Taxes include a 30% increase on South African goods and a 25% levy on automotive imports, something that is going to hurt a lot of businesses.